Hello and welcome. The Portavood Institute for the Study of the Iranian World welcomes you to another episode of our podcast, Legacies of Ancient Persia. Join us as we further explore the many legacies of ancient Persia and its relevance to global patrimony. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Legacies of Ancient Persia. This week, we welcome back Dr. Nikolaus Overtoom, a professor of ancient history at Washington State University, to the podcast. He returns to discuss his new book, The Parthians at War, Combat Logistics, Reputation, and the First War with Rome, which examines Parthian militarism beyond tactics to include logistics, reputation, and interpreting Parthians through Greek and Roman sources while seeking their agency. He also discusses a new 2-week teaching module on Parthians for world history instructors, including interactions with Rome and Han China, and offers a revisionist reframing of the First Rome-Parthia War as a longer series of conflicts. We hope you enjoy this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give our show a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify. Sweet. Okay, well, welcome back to the podcast, Nick. This is really exciting because I think you are the first person to come back because you have an updated project. So I think this is going to be pretty fun and pretty great. But for everyone who is tuning in today, welcome. I'm not going to be spending time asking our guest today to talk about how he got into Iranian studies. Again, if you would like to hear that story, I would refer you to his original episode, which I can link in the show notes. So if you would like to go listen to that episode, please feel free to do so. So with that, welcome, Nick, and tell us about your new book.
So first off, I'd like to thank you again for platforming me. I'm glad to be your first second. So version 2 of our talk. I'm very excited to share with your audience that I have a new book that has just been published by Bloomsbury Publishing. It's titled The Parthians at War, Combat Logistics, Reputation, and the First War with Rome. This is a project that has taken several years to put together. I actually originally didn't plan on this being a book project. It just sort of happened. So I just had some good meetings with the publisher. I had some great opportunities to share some ideas at conferences and in various other publications. And then it just sort of felt like this was an area of interest and need in the field. I know that there's another book, I think coming out maybe later this year, that also is going to be a bit focused on Parthian warfare. I believe that's with the Sword and Pen Publishing. So it might be a little more of a general audience work. But what that means, I suppose, is that there's continued growing interest in Parthian studies and continuing growing interest on trying to understand who the Parthians are and how they were important to ancient history. So the book in sort of total has sort of a lot of focus on sort of the militarism of the Parthians, but it's more than just the X's and O's of tactics and strategy. Of course, that's in there. But I also wanted to kind of approach the view of the Parthians from the Greek and Roman sources, of course, and as much as possible, trying to understand the Parthians on their own terms, understanding, if where possible, kind of their own agency, how the Parthians approached warfare and the building of their own reputation, even if it's through the eyes of their neighbors and rivals, the Greeks and the Romans. So I really wanted to make sure that it was more than just kind of the nuts and bolts of battles and generals and that sort of thing. The book begins with a general overview of the rise of the Parthians, so their origin, how they get established in the sort of northeastern corner of the Iranian plateau, their various struggles with the Seleucid Empire and the Bactrians as their neighbors, and then the success of the Parthians and then rapidly expanding in kind of the middle 2nd century all the way to the early 1st century under the leadership of 2 really successful military kings, Mithridates I and Mithridates II, lots of Mithridates. But in essence, that sort of introduction I thought was necessary and worthwhile to sort of build the platform, the foundation of demonstrating to the reader that the Parthians established this great imperial space, and they did this in many ways through their skills as warriors, through their ability as leaders, their accomplishments as rulers. And a lot of ways that also kind of helps for those who are aware or interested. My first book, Reign of Pharaohs, The Rise of the Parthian Empire in the Hellenistic Middle East, that really focuses on that first chapter in detail. So it was kind of a way to kind of make a nice segue from book 1 to book 2, which I thought was also worthwhile there. Second chapter, for those of you who are real military history heads, that's the chapter for you. It's the Parthian military. That focuses on concepts of logistics. How did the Parthians feed and water their large horse-based armies? How did they supply their horses? How did they supply their men? So on and so forth. Also, the concept of how the army is formed into kind of cohesive military units, how it's sort of coordinated on the battlefield, how it's led, so on and so forth, what the equipment looks like, what kind of horses are being used. And then the last section of that, which is chapter 2 is the longest chapter by far. The last section of chapter 2 focuses on a section on tactics and a section on strategy. In essence, through my various studies of the Parthians militarily, I find that much like a lot of examples of sort of cavalry-based hit-and-run warfare, there's sort of these standard tactics and strategies that these armies pursue for success on the battlefield against more heavy infantry-based rivals like the Greeks, Macedonians, or Romans would be. So with tactics, I broke it down into three key areas, what I call the massed assault tactic, which is essentially this initial rush that the Parthian army would make if an enemy formation or an enemy army was in sort of discoordinated or in a vulnerable position, right? This idea that you have sort of this initial burst of energy, this initial rush, trying to catch the enemy off guard right off the bat, take advantage of sort of the chaos of that moment, see if you can break off a piece of the enemy army to destroy or overwhelm them ideally, right? So that's kind of this initial sort of burst. Sometimes that works for the Parthians. Sometimes that doesn't, right? Sometimes the opportunity is there and they seize it, and sometimes the opportunity just isn't there. But the Parthians are very flexible, and so they would be able to very seamlessly transition to the other sort of areas of tactical approach in battle that I emphasize. So the next one I call the hit and run tactic, which is obviously a staple of sort of cavalry-based, bow-based militarism. If a massed assault wasn't going to be able to accomplish the goal of defeating the enemy, they could pull back from that mass assault and they could transition rather seamlessly into this sort of hit and run tactic where essentially they start harassing the enemy. And how they're doing this is they're using the speed and maneuverability of their horses. They're using the combination of their light horse archers matched with their heavy armed cataphracts. And in essence, in this sort of hit and run approach, what they're doing is they're trying to outmaneuver and pepper the enemy, right? Basically, they're using their speed and aerial superiority to force the enemy in sort of into a condensed position that's very vulnerable. And they can essentially just sort of hit them with arrows over and over again. They work on this tactic that becomes famous in the ancient world known as the Parthian shot. Now, I would argue that, of course, the Parthians don't invent this sort of approach to hit and run warfare. This is something that had been practiced on the various steppes of Eurasia for hundreds of years. But the fact that it's called the Parthian shot is because the Parthians make it famous amongst the Greeks and the Romans. So as far as the Greeks and the Romans are concerned, this is a Parthian innovation. And essentially it also that sort of recognizes that this is a very effective sort of approach to combat. This is something that the Greeks and Romans are very aware of and concerned about. And it's sort of this process of where Parthian horse archers in particular are able to cycle toward and away from an enemy formation, all the while being able to deliver fire, right? So even in both directions, they're able to be quite accurate and quite deadly. And what that essentially establishes is this constant barrage. And there's sort of this psychological element to the hit and run tactic where you simply sort of wear out the enemy formation physically and mentally, to the point where either they make mistakes because they physically aren't able to hold their position anymore, or they make mistakes because they mentally crack and they make sort of a drastic move, right, that offers an opportunity. We have great examples of this, especially from the discussions of the Battle of Carrhae from Plutarch and Cassius Dio. But this is not the only example. They used this over many generations very effectively against the Seleucids and Romans. I should say that essentially my book chronologically focuses on the establishment of the Parthian kingdom under Arsaces, the first king of the Arsacid dynasty, and carrying it all the way through the campaign of Mark Antony. So basically right up to the formation of kind of the end of the Roman Republic, sort of that I felt that was a good sort of area to focus upon. In some ways, the relationship, well, in many ways, the relationship and the engagement of the Romans and the Parthians changes somewhat drastically after the establishment of Augustus's imperial regime. So I thought that was a nice little break. It kind of encompasses what we would call the sort of chronological Hellenistic age. And I thought it was a good way to sort of demonstrate how these things are being used over many generations. But yeah, in the hit and run strategy or hit and run tactic, essentially you deliver that constant fire. You're hoping for the enemy to become weak or make mistakes. A good example of a mistake would be sort of a mistimed or a misjudged countercharge, where you break formation and you try to chase the Parthian archers away. And in doing so, you create gaps in your line. You also isolate that detachment that is broken off from the main force. And that's where your cataphracts come in. Cataphracts are essentially this guard unit during this hit and run tactic where some of them have bows and they are delivering fire, but largely what they're doing is they're forming these walls of protection for the horse archers so that when the horse archers are counterattacked, the cataphracts can then use their mass assault tactic. They can, strike quickly, shock tactics, overwhelm the detachment, so on and so forth. So in essence, that's how that works, and that can kind of go on for minutes or hours. The Parthians, well, the sources Plutarch and Cassius Dio emphasize that at Carrhae, the Parthians brought extra arrows, so they had lots of extra ammunition that they brought up with a camel caravan. I would argue, and I've sort of pointed to other evidence that this isn't a singular innovation of the Parthians that just suddenly happens for this battle and then goes away. That actually, for many generations, they've developed this way to be able to supply their their mounts and their bowmen with supplies that they need to be successful on the battlefield for many hours. And so, in essence, if for whatever reason that doesn't work, right, you can't take them out by mass assault, you can't take them out with the sort of harassment of the hit and run. There's that last tactic that the Parthians are really expert at as well, what I call the feigned retreat tactic. The classic example of this is the coaxing of Crassus's son Publius away from the main Roman army with roughly about 7,000 men, and in essence, isolating that much smaller unit through this feigned retreat tactic and then overwhelming it and destroying it. So in this feigned retreat tactic, essentially what you do is you create this sense of chaos, right? That the army, right, the Parthian army is fleeing from the battlefield, right? They've given up the assault, they've run out of ammunition, right? They've lost coordination, they've lost discipline. And in this moment of chaos, which from the Parthians' perspective is very much intentional and organized, the enemy, the Seleucids, the Romans, take this as a real moment of weakness and therefore a real moment of opportunity for them. And essentially what the feigned retreat tactic is trying to accomplish from the perspective of the Parthians is it's trying to create that opportunity to change and win the engagement, right? If hitting them with blunt force didn't work, if harassing them didn't work, well, maybe pretending to run away will create that new opportunity. And the idea here is through this sort of concept of they're routing, they're running away. The enemies generally become overconfident. They make reckless decisions. They engage very aggressively. And what that allows the Parthians to do usually is to isolate a very important segment of the enemy army and then destroy that in force and then return to the main army. So two great examples of this. As I mentioned, destruction of Publius at the Battle of Carrhae. He loses essentially his entire force, including his own life. He has his soldiers kill him so that he's not captured, but he's later found, his body's recovered, and the Parthians decapitate him and then take his head back to the main force as a trophy to terrify his father and the other Romans. But the other great example of this from the wars of the Parthians and the Seleucids is there's a Seleucid king named Antiochus VII, who I've argued is the last great and capable Seleucid king. And a long line of very militarized, accomplished warriors as far as the Seleucid dynasty is concerned, a dynasty that looked up to Alexander the Great and Philip II of Macedon and very much emulated them as warriors. Antiochus VII is just like his predecessors. He wants to be seen as a great conqueror, as a great warrior. The sources emphasize that he aspired to be the next Alexander. He aspired to be the next Antiochus the Great. So he has this energy about him, which is all about sort of forcefulness, aggressiveness, conquest, so on and so forth. Well, over the course of his campaign, he becomes a bit overstretched. He's got a large army, and he's trying to occupy these new territories in Mesopotamia and Media, sort of modern day Iraq and kind of northwestern Iran. And he has to garrison them over winter. And in the moment of garrisoning his army, he split it up into a bunch of different camps The peoples who are having to support his army are very angry at the abusiveness of his soldiers. And on a given day, the Parthians coordinate this sort of mass uprising against these garrisons. And so essentially, word comes to Antiochus at his winter camp, his forward base in southern Media, that his garrisons, especially in Babylonia, are being slaughtered by basically these rebellions. So, in his haste, he puts together his vanguard and tries to march rapidly through the Zagros Mountains into Babylonia to sort of salvage the situation. And it just so happens that as he's making this sort of force march, in comes the Parthian army, right? Using their speed to be able to catch up to him in the passes of the Zagros. And over the course of this engagement, in essence, Antiochus has a much smaller force, but he is convinced of the superiority of himself and his men. He disregards the advice of his officers to seek safety in the mountainside, where essentially the cavalry will not be as big of a factor. He wants to fight the Parthians mano a mano in the valley of the mountain pass. And this is a terrible mistake on his part. So, over the course of this battle, the Parthians use all three of their tactics. They try the massed assault, they try the hit and run, and eventually, because this dense formation of heavy infantry is still holding, they turn to this feigned retreat tactic. Antiochus VII, with sort of a select group of his bravest and fastest soldiers, makes a charge to try to drive off the enemy force. The Parthians give out, sort of giving the sense that, oh, this is what Antiochus has been waiting for. He's broken the will of the Parthians to fight. They're going to run away. They're fleeing from us. So he pursues very aggressively, and eventually he becomes isolated. The Parthians end their feigned retreat, turn to their massed assault and hit and run tactics, and overwhelm his position. According to our sources, he either dies in this assault from the Parthian cavalry or he escapes and commits suicide to avoid being captured. So we have these two really great examples of kind of the ebb and flow and how this would work. Each battle, of course, is different. Nothing about this is robotic or sort of interconnected necessarily. You have to do one to accomplish the other. The Parthians are very flexible and interchangeable with how they use these various tactics. But it demonstrates that they're not simply these barbarians who are just sort of these reckless attackers who have no sort of sense of sort of tactics and the ability to outmaneuver and overwhelm enemy formations using psychological warfare. That this is a very sophisticated military and that they are very effective on the battlefield, not just because they have very good horses and very good equipment. They're also very smart about how they tactically approach enemy formations that are not easy targets for them to attack. Do you have any questions, Lexi, about the tactical stuff before I move on to the strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, being not a warfare person, I don't know where this fits in, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because if it goes into your next section, then that's even better as well. I like how you picked up really quickly, sort of toward the end of that answer there, on bringing in and having this dimension of psychological warfare. And one of the things that I'm just really curious about personally is, again, as not being a warfare person, I don't know of many instances in history just generally because it's not the sort of thing I normally pay attention to. But I was just watching a documentary the other day on Vlad Dracula. I know it's like a completely different time period in history, but they had this whole thing about how he employed psychological warfare to like devastating effect. And so this documentary was talking about some of the things he did that just was so like outrageous for the time. And so I was just wondering, like, yeah, since you mentioned they have a dimension of that, obviously that is further back in time than Vlad Dracula. So what kind of psychological warfare would the Parthians really have been engaging in and what made it so like devastatingly effective?
Yeah. And the fact that what Vlad's doing towards the Ottomans is in a way similar. It's kind of like this using gruesomeness and sort of shock value to intimidate and scare your enemy, right? And if you can let that win you the battle, then that's great, right? If you don't have to actually fight because you've scared your enemy into making a different decision, then why not do that? So the Parthians are not, they're not unique in this sense. The Greeks, Macedonians, and Romans are using plenty of psychological, gruesome warfare. The Romans, in particular, are very violent people when it comes to war. So it's not that they're unique in their sort of violent or gruesome approach to war, but they have their own kind of flair to it, their own sort of version of this. So ways that we sort of see this sort of psychological warfare being employed by the Parthian army, the nature of their attacks, right? This idea of aerial superiority and superiority of speed, right? This idea that they can move and attack from a distance, and that gives them a huge advantage that also is very frustrating to a sort of more heavy infantry based, slower army. They don't, the Romans and the Greeks complain all the time about how the Parthians are deceptive and disingenuous and untrustworthy. And that's a reflection of their military approach. The idea that they won't fight us man to man, mano a mano, right? Heavy infantry to heavy infantry. As far as the Greeks and the Romans are concerned, that's the civilized, manly way to fight. And so the Parthians using horses and bowmen as the primary approach to their military is very much at odds with the military style and approach of their rivals to the west. So with that, right, the Parthians use that to their advantage, right? This idea of striking from a distance. We see from the sources all the time that, especially in the Hellenistic period, the Parthians had access to superior metal quality. And so therefore their arms and armament were more effective than Greek and Roman counterparts. Plutarch and Cassius Dio in particular emphasized over and over again at the Battle of Carrhae that the arrows and of the Parthian horse archers and the pikes or lances of the Parthian cataphracts are doing devastating injuries, are creating devastating injuries, doing devastating damage to the Roman formation, where the Roman armor, their shields are really ineffective, that essentially the arrows and pikes are sort of slicing through the Roman armor with quite a bit of ease. We have multiple examples of Plutarch and Cassius Dio talking about men who are essentially stapled to the ground, right? Because they have so many arrows in them, or that they can't take their shield off because their arm is essentially stapled to the shield. Really grisly stuff, right? Getting shot in the eye, shot in the neck, these sort of visceral things where you're not even seeing where the attack is coming from, right? You're just hit by an arrow, or your neighbor is hit by an arrow. And that really would, I think, would very easily start wearing on you psychologically, right? This sort of desperation and frustration with not being able to strike back. You're just a sitting target, that sort of thing. And then also, as far as the cataphracts are concerned, lots of emphasis in these examples from Greek and Roman writers of just the force, the impact, how fast and how strong their horses are, how well protected they are. So you can't really attack them very effectively. You have to essentially either pull the rider off, which is quite difficult, right? Get him off his horse, and then he's very vulnerable. Or what we also see is you have to stop the momentum of the charge, which means you have to absorb that charge, and then you have to crawl underneath the cataphract's horse and stab the horse in the underbelly, which is the only part of the horse that isn't protected, which obviously is very difficult and very dangerous to do because horses don't like getting stabbed in their underbellies. So yeah, a lot of these sort of things are very visceral, very violent looking. The lances or the pikes of the cataphracts, both Plutarch and Cassius Dio emphasize that they could skewer a man. I think as Cassius Dio emphasizes that it could transfix two men at a time. And so there's this sort of idea of it's very violent, very scary, and that really does over attrition over time, that really does wear on the Roman army. Other ways that we see really interesting sort of modes of psychological warfare is, again, using the speed of the horses and the terrain of West Asia. So West Asia generally is fairly dry, at least in parts of kind of eastern Syria, northern Mesopotamia, those sorts of areas where like Carrhae was located. And what we have are examples of using the hit and run tactic, right, where they're cycling and delivering their volleys, but also in the course of that cycling of the horses, what they're doing is they're churning up the dirt, they're churning up the sand, they're building these huge dust clouds that are done on purpose to then drift into the enemy formation. And essentially, you then create this dust or sand cloud that not only blinds the enemy formation even more than they already are, but also it creates great thirst, it creates added exhaustion. And so these sorts of elements also kind of really work towards this idea of a psychological element of really trying to get into the heads of the enemy, to really scare them into submission, scare them into making mistakes. And so I think that, again, it demonstrates that the Parthians are very warriors. They're very clear about what we can do, what we're skilled at, how we can approach combat effectively. But they're also thinking about, all right, well, how can we win a battle without, well, how can we win a battle that's most expedient, right? What are the sort of psychological deceptions or tricks or tactic strategies that we can use that we can then frustrate an enemy into giving up, or frustrate an enemy into making a mistake that then we can take advantage of?
It's interesting. I'm one thing that came up while you were talking there was Gruesome images. Yep, we've seen it. I guess they did it too. A lot of people did it, and it was really effective. I mean, just, yeah, very heavily visual things. I'm curious. Obviously, you want to try to win expediently without too much of a cost to your own side if you're in a battle. Would they, as part of a psychological element, would they play around with like sound more than visuals to either actually defeat the enemy, or would they have been interested as well in, like, if you just create like a big sound or something that just sounds really scary, if that caused like the enemy line to suddenly flee in terror, would they take that too? Or is like, would they, was their goal more to like actually like beat people than make them run away?
Yeah, that's a great question. Absolutely, we know that the Parthians like to use visual intimidation, right? They like to use the sort of the shine of their armor to reflect the sunlight. We know that they like to have sort of flamboyant, sort of plumed helmets. They like banners. So anything that could kind of make them look bigger and more intimidating, they like that visually. We know that they emphasized the drums in their army and on the battlefield. And so they would create this low rumbling at first, and then that rumbling would get louder and louder as a charge was imminent. So that's another way to kind of use sound as a sort of this amplifying of tension, right? That the attack is about to happen, so on and so forth. We also know that there were certain Indian warriors that would have particular hairstyles or even wear sort of styles of war paint, again, to kind of create an intimidating look to them, which again is not, it's not unique to the Parthians. A lot of different peoples in the ancient world are using similar ideas, but there certainly are ways that the Parthians are using audiovisual elements in how they're approaching a battle or how they're approaching a particular phase of the engagement that certainly lend itself to trying to intimidate the enemy.
Mm. That's really impressive. It's really cool. I like the idea of drums because that to me would have been terrifying to hear, since you can hear things sometimes a lot further than you can see them,
Yeah,
depending
and
on
the
conditions.
other thing that the Roman sources emphasize is this kind of idea of a war cry. It's not clear as to what that would sound like. The idea being that again the Parthians recognize that like an audio intimidation is an important facet of the engagement. So sort of cry, this yell that would also be a part of any particular assault. I think in the American context of like the rebel yell, right? This is something that kind of becomes
Mm.
this iconic element of an actual aggressive assault that's meant to kind of unnerve the enemy in this very important moment before a particular engagement of soldiers. Yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah, these sort of things tactically, I think, demonstrate sort of the nuance of the Parthians, the great skill of the Parthians, the unique abilities of the Parthians on the battlefield. And I think also why I found this so interesting is that these tactical innovations, these tactical employments by the Parthians, they're reflective at the strategic level as well. So essentially, right, mass assault tactic, hit and run tactic, feign retreat tactic, I find that these very much pair well with sort of three identical, or not identical, but similar overlapping strategical approaches to any particular campaign or war. What I call the overwhelm strategy, the harass strategy, and the deceptive withdrawal strategy. Overwhelm strategy, pretty simple, right? If an enemy is invading you, or if you're invading them, if they're in a vulnerable position, if they're on a long march where they're thirsty and hot, try to attack them as quickly as possible and overwhelm them, destroy them. This is a good example. A good example of this is the overwhelming of Antiochus VII's army as he moves through the Zagros Mountains. Right, he has that small vanguard. He's trying to get back to his men, and the Parthians show up with their overwhelm strategy and destroy him. Right, so we have good examples of how this is a very effective tool. Right, strike fast, strike hard. The Parthians have really good cavalry, so they're able to cover land very quickly. They're able to rapidly move from one region to the other. This is a huge advantage to them. The harass strategy is essentially a way to, again, create this middle ground where we don't have either the manpower or the opportunity to just simply attack and overwhelm an enemy army. So instead, what we want to do is we want to skirmish with them. We want to delay them. We want to test them. We want to create potential opportunities. There's really good examples of this again throughout the rivalry with the Seleucids and the Romans. A good example of this is Demetrius II, who's another Seleucid king who invades Mesopotamia. He is moving through Mesopotamia, and essentially the Parthians are kind of skirmishing with him as he moves towards Babylonia, which is sort of his initial goal. And in these skirmishes, what they're doing is they're taking reconnaissance, right? They're testing like what does his army look like? How big is his army, right? What are the capabilities of his army, so on and so forth. And then they're eventually going to retreat and allow him to occupy Babylonia. This is seen in the sources as a great weakness of the Parthians, right? That they are cowardly and weak, and they were defeated by Demetrius. And the only reason why they ultimately beat Demetrius is they trick him, right? They deceive him, right? Which is, again, kind of a common literary trope of how the Parthians ever beat the civilized Greeks, Macedonians, and Romans. But the reality is that harass strategy, that testing Demetrius as he moved towards Babylonia, that served a lot of purposes, right? It gave a lot of good information to the Parthians about what Demetrius's invasion is and what it looks like and how capable he is. It gave also a sense to the enemy that the Parthians are not very good at fighting, right? This idea that, okay, we skirmish with these horsemen and then they run away. And so therefore, right, we don't really have to worry about them, right? So it kind of creates this complacency. And when Demetrius arrives in Babylonia, that's exactly what happens. He turns to dominating the major cities of the region. He kind of takes his eye off the fact that there's still Parthian armies in the area. And then those Parthian armies converge on him and very effectively overwhelm and destroy his army and capture him. He becomes a captive of the Parthians for much the rest of his adult life, up until his brother Antiochus VII invades. And then he's released by the Parthians to try to sow discontent and civil war in Syria. So that dynamic of those brothers, both leading failed invasions of the Parthian Empire, very interesting. Something that, again, I like to emphasize in my books, because I feel like if you talk about the Parthians, you mostly think, well, most people, right, when you mention Parthia, if they have any sort of sense of the Parthians, they think Crassus and Carri. But I like to emphasize in my scholarship that this transcends so much earlier and later than Carri, that this rivalry and these sort of interactions are so much more interesting than just Crassus and Carri. But the harass strategy is, again, a good example of where we don't have the ability to overwhelm the enemy. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of test them. We're going to test them. We're going to give ground and sort of bide our time, collect information, and then hopefully that'll create an opportunity later. And then there's the deceptive withdrawal strategy, which, again, much like the feigned retreat tactic, that process of a deceptive withdrawal strategy is that you are trying to convince the enemy that you are fleeing, that you are giving up, right? That you're running away, that you're not going to fight. And in that, what you're trying to instill in the enemy, again, is this idea of complacency, going, oh, well, okay, the Parthians aren't really a big deal. We don't have to worry about them. Let's go about our business, do other things. Or you're trying to get them to be overly aggressive, to give chase, right? To move their army much more rapidly than they should, right? Creating logistical problems for them, so on and so forth. And so essentially, again, much like their tactical approach, these three strategic approaches, they don't all have to be applied. They don't all have to work together necessarily, but they can, right? And the Parthians are very good about being able to sort of seamlessly switch from one to the other as circumstances change, as opportunities arise. And that's what I argue is one of the main reasons why they are so militarily effective against the professionalized, very accomplished armies of the Seleucids and the Romans, is because the Seleucids and the Romans don't truly understand or appreciate how they fight. They, of course, know that they're a horse-based warrior people, but instead of recognizing, oh, the Parthians are trying on purpose to manipulate us through hit and run or feign retreat tactics, harass strategy, deceptive withdrawal strategies. Instead, what you have is kind of this cultural arrogance of, we're superior to the Parthians, they're barbarians, this is how barbarians act. And so therefore, they're not trying to do anything. This is just the weakness of our barbaric enemy, right? They run away, they don't fight like men, they try to take advantage. And then anytime that the Greeks, the Macedonians, or the Romans lose, they're desperate to search for, why did this happen, right? If we're superior to the barbarians, then the barbarians shouldn't beat us. So they have to sort of explain, well, what are the reasons for why we lost? And really, the reaction to that is generally pretty similar over time and space throughout the sources. It's either the failing of the general, the defeated general. Crassus gets the worst of this, right? His reputation is much maligned. The idea that Crassus is the one who's defeated, not the Romans at Carri, that sort of thing. The other explanation is that the Parthians tricked us. right? They didn't fight like men. They deceived us. They created some sort of dishonorable stratagem to ambush us or something along the lines of that. So what you have in the source tradition is this lack of true understanding and respect for the abilities and capabilities of the Parthians, that they, on the surface, they understand that the Parthians are good warriors and that they can fight well, but there's really nothing much above that. The Greeks and the Romans never view the Parthians as peers. They always view them at the end of the day as these barbarians that have these natural inferiorities and these natural limitations that ultimately, if the Greeks and the Romans live up to their superiority, will always overcome, will always triumph. And it's only kind of these mistakes, right? Either by a particular general to who are, the tropes are like a greedy general or a cruel general or something like that. Or, right, it's that we just weren't paying attention and the Parthians ambushed us. And so, yeah, we lost, but really that's not an honorable way to fight. And so therefore we can kind of make sense of that. We can do the mental gymnastics that we need to do in order to make right with that.
Okay, so this is all really interesting because, yeah, like they are incredibly efficient, as you've said. It's like they're cavalry heavy. They have really well-trained horse and archers. I mean, it's like a well-oiled machine. So one part of, maybe I'll call it like the logistical end, is like if they're so good and seem to put all their energy into their cavalry and being able to sort of pop up and get out of there like lightning, everything's about speed, basically. What about like, should, if they're confronted with, and I don't know if they would be confronted or if it's other people who would try it against them, but this idea of like siegecraft or maintaining garrisons or things of that nature where you can't just use your horse and sort of be fast. I mean, I'm assuming that the Parthians, even if they didn't have many, I'm assuming that they probably wanted to maintain some kind of garrisons somewhere. So I'm wondering if that's not really their specialty. Are they like hiring mercenaries to do it for them who are like better, or do they just try to not because that's not what they want? That's not what they're good at.
Yeah, yeah. Again, really good question. The Parthians are a hugely successful people, establishing a long-lived and vibrant civilization in part because they marry the military ethos and ability of the larger steppe peoples, the Scythians, right, and all the various branches of that identity, with the skillful ability to run a large and interconnected imperial state. That they 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 have this semi-nomadic background, right? That's their traditional origin, right? It's like this band of mercenary marauders who rally around Arsaces, and he establishes this kingdom where he integrates essentially his warband, his followers, with the already established sedentary aristocratic population, and that relationship, from all sort of evidence, worked very well, right? That relationship is a collaborative and working relationship largely for many generations, in fact. But what this means is as they conquer West Asia, they are, of course, absorbing large and urbanized regions that have been established since before the Achaemenid Empire, right? Going all the way back way into sort of the early history of early Mesopotamian civilization, right? So you have these important urban areas within this expansive empire. So, of course, the Parthians have to be able to protect these urban environments. So, you are absolutely right. A cavalry based army, their strength certainly is not siege attack or siege defense, right? That's not where the Parthians ideally want to find themselves. But their supposed ineptitude at this is much exaggerated by the Greco Roman sources. This idea that the Parthians simply are inept at being able to defend or attack cities, it's simply impossible, right? They wouldn't have been able to conquer West Asia if they couldn't take walled cities. So they certainly do have an ability. It's just not where they focus their energy. It's not their strength. This is both in the sense of the composition of their army, right? Cavalry is not best suited in a siege situation. But also, I found through work on this project that logistically, there's an explanation for this as well. it's hard to feed and water tens of thousands of horses. And often you are unable to just sit and do that for many months in one region. You'll exhaust those foodstuffs, you'll exhaust the water supply. And so, again, one of the reasons why the Parthians generally move around their empire, especially in sort of rapid succession during campaigns, or even not during a campaign season, we have evidence that, of course, the Arsacids moved their court quite often, which would have sort of this royal retinue that would follow the king, kind of these quasi-permanent soldiers that would serve the king, is because of logistical concerns, right? We want to make sure that we're not overburdening one region over the other. Also, as you and your listeners are well aware, the topography, the agricultural productivity of West Asia drastically changes depending on kind of where you're talking about. And so some regions like Mesopotamia or Media or Bactria are quite agriculturally productive. They have a lot of ability to support a standing army, for example, where other regions simply just don't really have that opportunity because there's just not enough food productivity, there's not enough access to water, so on and so forth. So again, one of the reasons why siege warfare, both attack and defense, aren't ideal for the Parthians is because you're stuck in one place and you have to, day after day, find water and food, not only for your soldiers, but also for all their horses. So we see a lot of examples of where if the Parthians can attack and surprise a garrison and take the city quickly, they're happy to do that. We have plenty of examples of that. Anything that's sort of a siege situation, the Parthians are less interested in, tend to sort of weigh the cost and cost benefits, where we have some examples of, yes, we're going to sit down and we're going to lay a siege and we're going to essentially try to wait out the enemy garrison. A good example of this is there's a later civil war between two brothers. He's the fourth and Orodes the second. And Mithridates the fourth finds himself essentially besieged in Babylon. And his brother decides to wait him out over a series of months until essentially the garrison of Babylon capitulates. Now, part of the reason why that's possible for Orodes, who's besieging Babylon, is because Babylonia is very rich with resources, has access to water, has access to food. So a siege scenario there can kind of work. But you're not necessarily able to do that elsewhere. So good examples of this is the Parthians attack Antioch in Syria on multiple occasions. And sometimes they try to siege it, and sometimes they recognize there's just no way we're going to be able to besiege Antioch because we don't have the men, we don't have the resources. And so they simply go somewhere else. They try to do something else. And what they're trying to do mostly is they're trying to sort of pillage and harass the territory around the major city in order to coerce and coax the garrison out of the city itself. So essentially, they're trying to draw out the garrison away from the walls to have a more open engagement. So there are, of course, ways that the Parthians have to be creative to get around siege warfare. But it's just simply clear that the exaggeration that the Parthians are terrible at siege defense and siege attack, that's a distortion and a fabrication of the Greco-Roman literature. That's another sort of, as far as the Greeks and Romans are concerned, that's another example of their barbarity, right? Is that they can't take walled cities like we can.
Gotcha. Well, ask you about your new module because for all the listeners here, I think they'd be really interested to hear what you're working on and how it could really sort of change how hopefully people learn and teach about the Parthians.
Yeah, I'm very excited about this project. So again, it's one of those things that it came about as an opportunity while I was writing this book. So I was able to kind of overlap and borrow elements of what I've been working on outside of just, again, the X's and O's of strategy and tactics for the Parthians at war. I wanted to emphasize kind of culturally, like where the reputation of the Parthians comes from. Of course, that's a lot from the biased sources, but as much as possible, looking at coinage or cuneiform records, trying to understand the Parthians on their own terms. I wanted to understand the Parthians and their approach to warfare through kind of the geography of their empire. So I have a chapter that focuses on like the importance of Babylonia to their approach to conflict. And then obviously, again, one of the other focal points of the book is kind of that first war between Parthia and Rome, where I would admit that I'm a revisionist here. Traditionally, scholars view that first war as simply the war between the Parthians and Crassus. and they couch it usually as Crassus is the aggressor. Crassus forces this war upon the Parthians, and essentially he gets his comeuppance, right? That he sort of pursues an illegal war that ultimately ends in his ruin. I revised this very drastically. I emphasized that the true origin of the war actually isn't with the Romans, it's with the Parthians. I mentioned that War of the Brothers, Mithridates IV and Orodes II. Well, Mithridates IV, he flees temporarily to Syria, where he asks the Roman governor in Syria for military aid against his brother, a man named Gabinius. And Gabinius initially says yes, which declares war on Orodes. And so there's this sort of new concept of the origin of that conflict, and then also kind of the long durée of that conflict, that where traditionally scholars see the death of Crassus as the end of that first war. I actually argue that the first war between Rome and Parthia is really more like 100 Years' War of the medieval period, where it's a series of smaller engagements, smaller conflicts that kind of is taken as a whole. And the idea being that essentially this first war begins with that negotiation between Mithridates IV and Gabinius, but it actually doesn't end until essentially negotiations between Augustus and a later Parthian king named Phraates V. There's this famous meeting on the Euphrates between Gaius Caesar, the grandson of Augustus, and Phraates V, where they exchange gifts, they exchange honors, and they finally do recognize the Euphrates as this border between a Parthian and a Roman empire. So this is a very sort of new approach to this. This is something that I'm very excited to see what the feedback is from students and scholars as far as that's concerned. And these kind of new ideas are what I wanted to implement into that module as well. So the module has kind of everything that you would hope for. It's a teaching project that hopes to help and service secondary and college instructors who are new to teaching world history courses. Those of you who are familiar, world history courses are big and complex and difficult to teach because you're covering so much ground, right? You're covering so many peoples and so many places over so much time. So this is a project that's trying to help those who maybe are uncomfortable with portions of, or maybe all of, teaching a world history course. And they're basically these 2-week modules. And I was asked to build a module about Parthians, which I was very excited to do. To my knowledge, it's the only example of this available. So I'm really hoping that what it does is it further raises the profile of the Parthians, right? That now we'll have actual teachers teaching Parthian history in secondary and college courses, which for me is very exciting because the Parthians are heavily overlooked and they're rarely taught in even graduate school. I mean, in my graduate studies, I've rarely had the opportunity to actually spend time studying the Parthians in a classroom setting. So I'm really excited about the potential of exposure for the Parthians here. And like I said, it has something for everybody. It has some geopolitics, it has cultural developments, economic developments, religion, all of these sorts of things kind of patched together, sort of woven together. Also included here are interactions between the Parthians and the Greeks, the Romans, but also I added quite a bit of interaction with the Chinese, which was something that I was quite interested in sort of exploring myself and trying to sort of understand how the Parthians are creating these relationships internationally on their frontiers and how those relationships with either Han China and Rome have similarities, or where those relationships with Han China and the Romans are quite different. And so, again, that's something that I explore in that module. And I'm really excited. I just completed it in December. It's going to go out for testing this spring. And then I'm hoping to be able to meet back up with you later and sort of talk about kind of some of the more detailed elements and kind of some of the feedback. But yeah, it's a project that I'm very excited about, and I hope that people are interested in.
Yeah, well, it really sounds cool, and I hope you'll come back and talk to us about once it's actually in progress.
We can have a
And
trilogy.
yeah, exactly. We can have the Parthian Warfare trilogy, which is going to make so many people who love the Parthians happy. But it's good because I swear the Parthians truly are one of the many empires and people in antiquity that I do feel just get a little bypassed in favor of some of the bigger bullies on the block, as I may call them.
Yeah, the good news there is that there has been a real wave of attention and scholarship. There seems to be this real moment where Parthian studies is really starting to gain some momentum, and it's getting finally the attention and respect that it deserves. So for those of you who are listening who do have an interest in the Parthians, the good news is that there's really good scholarship that has been recently published, and there's more scholarship to come. And that the silver lining of the much maligned Parthians is that hopefully we can start changing that narrative and really start giving them the seat at the table that they deserve amongst the other great peoples of the ancient
Interested in learning more about the wonders of ancient Persia? Visit the UCLA Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran. The Gazetteer digitally preserves famous locations, World Heritage sites, and lesser-known areas from all time periods of ancient Iranian history. You can explore using the interactive map or visit the encyclopedic catalog for updates to the ever-growing list of archaeological sites. Visit www.irangazetteer.ucla.edu and learn more about what the Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran has to offer.
Yeah, well, the last question in our dying few moments that I would love to ask is, over the course of writing this book, what's something that you learned that you thought was amazing or super cool that you really had no idea?
I was really surprised by how much I really enjoyed researching logistics. And I think that it's very easy when you look at military warfare to focus on the battles, right, and the generals. It's less common to think about, well, how are people eating, right? Or how did they get water, right? Or how much water do you need for an army of 20,000 men? And so I found that process of kind of figuring out the logistical capabilities and the needs of the Parthians in war. That was really something I was very fascinated by. I felt it was really rewarding. And it made me, I think that the best scholarship is where you kind of challenge yourself and you think about things from a different perspective. And hopefully, what that means is that it allows you to evolve and grow as a scholar. And I really felt that my approach to kind of thinking about logistics as a part of sort of a larger sort of military framework or sort of a military ethos, that was something that I really enjoyed and something that really kind of helped push me to expand and elaborate the overall kind of focus of the book.
Oh, that's awesome. I really love hearing and learning about logistics as well. Also, probably because it's a bit more, I don't want to say like understudied, but it's like the forgotten part, as you were saying, where
Yeah.
some people are like, yeah, like, yeah, they want to focus on what happened in the battle, who died, or let's focus on this ditch or this trench or this whatever, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it is fun to think sometimes slow down and think, well, if you're moving this massive army from A to B, how did everyone get all of their things and move? And sometimes armies have to traverse really like inhospitable places. And sometimes, yeah, I think it does get lost that people are like, yes, well, they didn't just kind of pick up their bags and move. Like it wasn't that easy. So,
Yeah, I think it's easy, especially with like ancient history, to sort of disassociate as fellow human beings, where that's something you really have to fight against, right? These are not robots, right? They lived and they breathed and they needed to eat and they needed to use the restroom. And these are things that, you should think about when you're trying to understand them at a very human level. And unfortunately, something that's very human is conflict. And so therefore, right, I think those are ways that, right, you can humanize the X's and O's. And that was something that I was hoping to accomplish very quickly. I know we need to wrap up here. The other thing that I really enjoyed about this book was understanding the long sort of association of the Romans themselves with the Parthians, where the Romans over hundreds of years have this long rivalry with the Parthians, and they're always kind of thinking about what is Rome and what is the other. And the Parthians are kind of that perfect other for them. And so the final chapter of my book really emphasizes that this isn't something that's a vacuum or locked into a bubble, that this transcends many centuries going all the way into late antiquity, that the Romans are also thinking about the Parthians and the value of this relationship and the value of this rivalry and what it means to be Roman and therefore what it means to be not Roman.
well, I hope that people will go out and they will get the second book and then they will learn all the cool things that you have been talking about today. And I mean, I hope that it does well. also just being an exciting new book on the Parthians. So the final question I do want to ask is, can you remind people where to go find you if they want to see some of your other publications and or just get in contact to ask you questions?
Sure. So I'm an associate professor in ancient history at Washington State University. So if you Google my name and Washington State University, my faculty profile page will pop up there. I think that also should link to my academia page. So if you're interested in kind of my catalog of work, by all means, please do look at my academia page where I have full access to some of my articles, partial access to others. But by all means, if you reach out to me individually, I'm happy to send you things that I've published. But other than that, yes, please do check out the book or have your local library get you a copy. I really do hope that this reaches not only a scholarly audience, but students and a general audience as well. And I look very much forward to hearing the feedback.
Sounds good. Well, thanks again for coming on and looking forward to talking to you sometime in the future about the module.
Yes, absolutely, Lexi. Thank you so much.
Legacies of Ancient Persia is a Portavood podcast production, hosted and edited by Lexi Henning, with select episodes co-hosted by Marissa Stevens. Cover art provided by Hadley Leesman and original music by Brent Arhart. Established in 2017 as the premier research center for the study of ancient Iran, the mission of the Portavood Institute for the Study of the Iranian World is to engage in transformative research on all aspects of Iranian antiquity, including its reception in the medieval and modern periods, by expanding on the traditional domains of old Iranian studies and promoting cross-cultural and interdisciplinary scholarship. Thanks for listening to our show. It's available to stream on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Portavood Institute and at Portavood UCLA, or visit our website portavood.ucla.edu. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and review us. For podcast inquiries or questions about the Portavood Institute, please email us at portavoodpodcastproduction@gmail.com. We'll see you next time as we continue our deep dive into the legacies of ancient Persia.